Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. And a big hello to everybody in between. My name is Dan Balkaran, as you can see on the screen, and I'm going to be your employment lawyer for the next 30 minutes or so. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. My name is Dan Balkaran. I'm an employment lawyer, as it says at the bottom, at Samfiru, Tumarkin, Canada's leading employee side employment law firm. You can contact us or look at what we're all about at employmentlawyer.ca. You can reach us at help@employmentlawyer.ca. And you can call us at 1-855-821-5900. Okay, so while we're waiting for your questions to roll in, I'll just talk a little bit about what has broadly been the main issue in employment law for the last, particularly employee side employment law for the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, something like that. And that is people losing their jobs or being put on, some sort of suspension, unpaid leave for failing to comply either with a COVID-19 policy, COVID-19 vaccine policy from their employer, or a government mandate. So requiring employees in a specific sector to be vaccinated. I always start off the show for the last 6 months with just an explanation of the difference between the two, because people confuse the word mandate is sort of thrown around by the media a lot, and it sort of means both things to the average person. So a mandate, if your employer says to you, you must be vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated, you will be fired or you'll be put on suspension. That is an employer policy that didn't exist before when it implemented it. And for most people, that means you worked at your job for almost 2 years before this policy was implemented. Depending upon what your actual legal position is with respect to your employment contract, it's very likely that I'll say this a different way. If your employer fires you for failing to get a vaccine, you will be entitled to, most likely, to severance, and then the amount of your severance, which can be up to 24 months, depending on your individual legal position, which is obviously a substantial amount. Which will depend on your legal position. I'll just leave it at that for now. But you have a legal entitlement to severance, most likely in the event that you've been terminated for failing to comply with your employer's new policy that you get a vaccine mandate, or that you get vaccinated. However, that right to severance is extinguished by a government mandate that says no. You in order for you to be employed in a given employment sector, you must be vaccinated. That was what the trucker debate was all about, to a substantial degree, because the truckers couldn't do their job by delivering to the United States without being vaccinated, and they chose not to be vaccinated. In which case, effectively their employment contracts were with their right to work and their severance, so their contract of employment was effectively extinguished by the government. So that was broadly what it's about. Or what those were about, and why. I won't go into what the truckers were, or what their reasoning for what they were doing was, but that was sort of the core legal issue that was in play. And so the difference between the two is, if it's an employer policy, you're entitled to get severance in the event of your termination. If it's a government mandate, you don't. That's just sort of the broad strokes. Okay, so there have been a number of people who have brought claims with respect to losing their jobs from an employer bringing employer imposing a vaccine policy on employees, and some of those employees did not get the vaccines, and so they were either suspended, put on an unpaid leave, or they were fired. And in cases where there wasn't a government mandate, those employees had a case for severance, or have a good case for severance. But I think now that there's been sort of a Canada-wide relaxation of restrictions and a sort of broad strokes acknowledgement that the pandemic isn't over, but that society is sort of moving to the second phase, which is we're at where we're at, and we're going to live with what we're going to live with, or we're going to live with the pandemic as best we can. I think all of those cases get a lot stronger. I think that and I know employers, broadly speaking, are fighting pretty hard on those cases, but I think the employees, their cases have gotten quite a bit stronger by the fact that their governments everywhere seem to be relaxing their mandates and their restrictions, including in British Columbia, although we are the last to roll back some of our restrictions like vaccine passports. Okay, so we're still waiting for messages to arrive. Usually we have a number by now. Let me just check. I want to make sure that we don't have any technical issues. Bear with me a moment. I just want to make sure that all of you can get in here. All right. Well, while we're waiting for that, I'll just talk a little bit more about what we were just talking about, which was situations where an employer has imposed a mandatory vaccine policy on you, the employee, and you don't want to get the vaccine for whatever reason. I don't think your reasons are really that important. Although if you have bona fide medical reasons, that certainly can assist your case. So in everything that I was talking about how I was talking about severance. So just to back up here a second, your employer can terminate your employment at any time for any reason, barring a human rights protected ground. A human rights protected ground would be like your age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, ancestry, family status, religious belief, criminal record, disability, that kind of thing. We'll call it moral rights. So barring one of those, your employer can terminate your employment at any time. Your only legal right in the event of your termination is severance. Okay, so for many of you, when you're evaluating what to do, you need to think about, well, if you need to be in that job for the next 12 years to get to retirement versus, maybe you're in line for 20 months of severance, less legal fees and taxes, what is it that makes the most sense for you? Okay. I'm going to pause that thought right now. I have a question that came in. So I don't know who this is. I can't pronounce their name, but I work in a childcare center located in Toronto, TDSB school that no longer requires masks. Is my employer allowed to keep the mask mandates? So an employer can keep that policy. So this actually ties in with what I was just talking about. So I think that employer policies that you keep masks, even though the government has said there's no more mask mandate, the question really becomes, well, if the employer imposes a mask mandate upon you and you refuse to wear a mask, and the employer fires you for it, are you entitled to severance? I don't have the answer to that question because there is no mandate for it, and technically, prior to the pandemic, you had worked for many years without that. But I suspect that the answer is you're probably not going to be entitled to severance if you get fired for refusing to wear a mask. I think that's probably a reasonable accommodation and compromise to satisfy all the disparate stakeholders in any employment setting. You have 100 people working in an office, and 50% of them are over the age of 50, and they want to have, so they're more vulnerable to COVID. So they want to have some protection, and the vaccine mandates, the employer doesn't require its employees to be vaccinated, but says everyone must wear a mask. I suspect that is going to be fine. But the question is my employer allowed to keep the mask mandates? Yeah, your employer can do what it wants, as long as it's not violating a human rights protected ground, which I wouldn't imagine that the mask mandates are. So it certainly can do that. And I don't think your employer would ever take issue with you for wanting to wear a mask if that's what you wanted to do. But certainly it's allowed to. The question for you is, if you don't want to wear a mask and they say you must wear a mask, would you be entitled to severance, in the event of your termination? I mean, I don't think that would be a very I don't think that would be a good claim to run. I think that your risk would be way too high, and it's probably something that you want to see if you can work out some sort of accommodation on if you don't want to wear a mask in the office and your office wants you to. I'll also say this. This thing is moving really quickly. It changes, as I've been saying for months now. You don't know what the next month is going to hold. Things get fluid because it's the meeting of what is the virus doing and what is public opinion doing. And just because the virus is doing something doesn't mean that the public opinion is in line with it, and then the policy coming out of it, is sort of consistent with what the virus is doing. And so this is sort of a roundabout way of saying, listen, if you're required to wear a mask now and you don't want to, probably in 2 months you won't be required to wear a mask. So I would just sit tight. Archie, what is the likelihood of having a job reinstated? Is that something you see happen? I assume, Archie, what's left unsaid in terms of what you were saying, in your question, is that you either were fired or put on a leave because you refused to be vaccinated. I assume that's what you're referring to. So employers all over the place are recalling their employees to work in just that scenario, right? And many of them aren't. It depends on what the employer wants to do. You gotta, when you look at it in sort of the larger milieu of labor right now, you've got a situation where there's a labor shortage everywhere, right? And so supply costs are going way up. It's one of the main things driving inflation, and so employers are having to pay top dollar to get employees, particularly skilled employees. I see ads on television now, advertising for, jobs, long haul trucking and things of that nature. So a lot of employers are, now that there's been a sort of sea change in pandemic restrictions, a lot of employers are offering reinstatement where they have suspended or terminated employees for failing to comply with their vaccine policies, but it's a case by case situation. Archie, if you're interested in getting your job back, might not hurt to reach out to the employer. In a situation like that, you're trading entirely on goodwill. Okay, so it's you don't have a legal right there. So in the event of your termination, I'll back up here actually. So if you were terminated or put on an unpaid leave that was not, if you're in Ontario, that was not an IDEL situation, an infectious disease emergency leave situation, you would have a claim for severance. Maybe you've initiated one, maybe you haven't. But if that's not something that's of interest to you and you'd rather go back to your job, sure, reach out to your job and see if they'll bring you back. But before you do that, Archie, I would strongly recommend that you talk to an employment lawyer just to assess what your legal position is, because I can't really glean very much from your message, and it's very difficult for me to tell exactly sort of what the background facts are in terms of, and therefore your legal position. So this is a good time to say you can reach us at employmentlawyer.ca, contact us at help@employmentlawyer.ca, and call us at 1-855-821-5900. Archie, definitely before you do something like reach out to your employer, you should talk to an employment lawyer. It's going to be worth it for you. Or I shouldn't say it's going to be worth it for you. I don't know what your situation is, but most of the time it's worth it. It's better to have, and this is one of the things I was going to say earlier, it's better to, before you take action, do it with, if you're in a situation that is you're unsure of with respect to your legal rights in employment, talk to a lawyer first and take your action with the benefit of understanding what your legal position is, with the benefit of legal advice. It's almost always going to be worth it. It's much, much harder for lawyers like me to come in after the fact, after you've done X, Y, and Z, for me to try to clean up what's happened. That happened a lot during the height of vaccine terminations, where employees would say, no to the vaccine mandate, the vaccine policy, so refused to get the vaccine, refused testing as an accommodation, rapid testing as an accommodation, refused to wear a mask, and then were fired, and then asked me to come in and see if I could somehow get them severance in that situation. And it makes any lawyer's job a lot more complicated. So it's always better, that your actions are advised or properly advised by a lawyer ahead of time than having us come in after the fact, because it sometimes we can't work miracles. So, okay, next one, Steph. When I was talking about severance, legal fees, and taxes, for taxes, you mean the tax liability on the severance? Also, is a severance taxed income the same as your income? These are great questions. So, Steph, I'm gonna give you the full answer, and it's gonna be a little bit complicated, but when you earn income, you're on payroll, and when you work for an employer, you're on payroll, and the government, which always wants, it wants its tax money, we'll say, taxes you at a specific rate, which is commensurate with your income, or at least it's pursuant to your income. And so the government knows you make X, therefore your tax bracket is Y. Okay? And depending on what your income is, depends on where your tax bracket is. Okay. So when you lose your job, there are two ways. The government still wants its pound of flesh out of any money that you get. Okay. But how you get paid your severance determines how the government is going to get its taxes. Okay. So if you get paid out, if you're still on payroll and you get a salary continuance, for example, so your salary is going to continue for 6 months, and at which point it stops. Let's say that's the settlement that you worked out with your employer. If you're on a salary continuance on payroll and normal deductions apply, that salary continuance, your pay every month, will get taxed at your normal income tax bracket rate. Plus, you would still continue to lose CPP and EI. So your bottom line shrinks way down. In some cases, it can be as much as well, it won't be as much as half, but you get the idea. There's a lot coming off the top. However, if you settle it out for a lump sum, 99 times out of 100, you're going to be paid out as what's called a retiring allowance. Now, a retiring allowance, it's kind of it's a little bit confusing because it has the word retiring in there, but retiring allowance is just the term that is used to describe income, severance payment, effectively, when you're no longer on payroll. So it's not income, it's a retiring allowance, but it's just an alternate payment vehicle. Okay. And the government still, even though you've been fired and you need the severance money to tide you over until you get your next job, the government still says, well, you know what, I want some of that money too. And so, but you don't have, it's not income at that point, it's a retiring allowance. So the government doesn't know what tax bracket it should tax you at. And so what it does is it taxes you with what's called a withholding tax, which at a flat rate at certain amounts, which I'm going to go into now. And then it adjusts it depending on what your income is for the year at tax time. So you won't know with any degree of certainty what the amount you're actually going to have at the end of the day is, because you don't know what your income is for the rest of the year. But the flat tax that comes off of it, the withholding tax, would be if you get 0 to 5,000 in severance, it's 10%. I guess technically 0 to 4,999.99 cents, and then 5,000 to 15,000 is 20%. Above 15,000, it's 30%. So the government will just take that right off the top. Okay, so and so that's something you have to account for when you are determining your settlement. Now, there are different ways you can try to allocate your severance in a tax favorable manner, like into your RSP account, so you don't have to pay any taxes until you break it when you retire, the RSP when you retire. But there are different things that you can do, and there are different other ways that you can perhaps structure your settlement in a way that is most tax advantageous to you, and that's one of the reasons why you go to a lawyer to assist with all that. But that's sort of generally the way the tax regime works when you're talking about severance. But yes, I've always found it a little strange that the government taxes your severance after you've lost your job, considering that that's money you need to tide you over. But it really is, when you look at common law severance, it's really just income you would have earned during the notice period. It just happens to be paid out 95% of the time as a lump sum. So if you get 6 months of your wage paid out as a lump sum, it's still calculated in time, like you the amount of you would have earned over those 6 months, and so the government treats it effectively as income, even though it's not income, because it needs its tax money. So I hope I answered your question as fulsomely as you needed, and please ask a follow-up question if you do have a follow-up question. So, okay, well, it's a light day today in terms of the questions coming in. So, trying to think if there are any other big ticket items that we need to discuss. I mean, I guess what happens if you've been terminated for violating a government vaccine mandate, and then the mandate is repealed because some of them are being rolled back. Is your right to severance still extinguished? I think this is a sort of a hot button topic in employment law right now. If you were let go on January 1st for failing to, sorry, one sec. Apparently Steph has more questions, but she's not able to get them in. So give me 1 second. While we're waiting for Steph's questions to come in, as I was saying, what happens if the vaccine mandate lifts? So, you were fired on January 1st for failing to comply with a vaccine mandate, so you couldn't work, and so you were fired, and your right to severance is extinguished. And then the vaccine mandate is lifted on March 1. What happens then? Is your right to severance permanently extinguished? Does it reinstate when the vaccine mandate is lifted? I mean, the prevailing sort of wisdom in our firm is that the vaccine mandate can't, since it's not permanent, can't have the same force and effect than if it just continued ongoing. I think this is a topic that we're going to hear more about in the coming weeks, and I'll certainly update you as I come back on here every 2 weeks. But for right now, I think it's a topic of uncertainty. Okay, so one of the earlier questions, the individual who had the mask requirement question as a follow-up question. If I was called back to work after refusing the vaccine, am I entitled to back pay? Well, that's a great question. It depends on if you want to go back, right? So if you want to pursue a severance claim, you can say to them, I want all my back pay. I would do this, by the way, with the benefit of a lawyer. And again, good time to say Help and Employment. You can reach us at helpandemploymentlawyer.ca, and 1-855-821-5900 is how you get a hold of us. It's too complicated. It's too complicated, and too many things in terms of your legal position will turn on what you say and what you offer and so forth. So I wouldn't try this without the benefit of a lawyer. But it depends what you want to do. So if you and I'm speaking primarily from BC, but I think the law in Ontario is the same as well. But if they issue a recall to you and say, hey, come back to work, and you say, sure, I'll come back to work provided you make me whole, you pay for all of my back pay for the time that I was away, in the event that you were on an unpaid leave and not just fired, then and maybe even in the case that you were fired, but I think that would be that's a different question, but I'll come back to that. But you were on an unpaid leave or a layoff, and you ask for your back pay. If they refuse to provide your back pay, then you continue with your severance claim, and it's not impaired at all. And sorry, I should explain what I mean by this. When you lose your job, you are pursuing common law. Let's say you have an entitlement to common law severance, which is the big one, which can be up to as much as 24 months. When you lose your job and you have an entitlement to common law severance, you cannot just sit back on your heels and let your employer pay for your own misfortune. You have to make reasonable efforts to mitigate your losses. And the way you do that is by looking for replacement employment. Okay, so making reasonable efforts to search for a job. Well, the best way to replace the job that you just lost is to work in the job that you just lost. And so if your employer says to you when you're on a layoff or an unpaid leave, hey, come back to work, and provided you haven't already triggered your constructive dismissal in the case of an unpaid leave. But like, hey, come back to work. Your severance claim might be stopped out right there. Okay, you might actually no longer have a severance claim because they've said come back to work. And if you say no, well, your severance claim is limited to from the start of well, your severance claim would be in big trouble. We'll just say that. And so, if they say come back to work and you don't want to come back to work and you just want to, you want your severance, then, saying to them, hey, pay me for my back pay, 9 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, they're not going to do that. And then you can pursue your severance claim for the whole thing. But, if you want to go back to work, well, then that's a negotiation you can have, and maybe you can meet halfway. You'll pay half your back pay and you go back. But in that situation, if you do want to go back to work, I would be careful not to scorch the earth too hard then, because the employer, if they get their back up about the situation, probably won't bring you back to work. So just be aware of that. But if you are wanting to go after severance, and that's what your employer has asked you in terms of, said, hey, you want to come back to work, certainly talk to an employment lawyer. Helpemploymentlawyer.ca, 1-855-821-5900. The other thing I said about that, in the event that your employer placed you on unpaid leave and then they recalled you, if you'd already triggered your constructive termination, if you already said, no, I reject this unpaid leave because you stopped my pay, I consider myself terminated, you have a little bit of, you could still ask for back pay in that situation, but and make it conditional on you going back, but your case is a little bit stronger, and I would certainly, again, talk to an employment lawyer about that. Okay. Jennifer, I received a work accommodation from my family doctor. She was unable to give me medical exemption because of the AHS mandates. I submitted it to my employer. I received accommodation from my family doctor. She's unable to give me a medical exemption. Isn't the accommodation an exemption? But if I'm denied at work, denied the work accommodation from my doctor, what are my rights? So your doctor said medical exam. Okay, so AHS mandate. Sorry, are you talking about, this is vaccine related, I assume, right? You're, and I don't really know who your employer is, and if your employer is the doctor or not, it's not really clear. But if your doctor hasn't given you an exemption, but has said you can work with these accommodations, so there is an issue, but you can work with these accommodations, whatever they are, and they deny those, that's a really good question. In most situations, if you have a disability, your employer is required to accommodate your disability to the point of undue hardship. And if it doesn't, then it, you may have a case both in human rights and for wrongful dismissal. But how does that, in your case, do you have a disability or you just have a vulnerability to COVID? It's not clear at all. I can't fully answer this question without more information. I'm sorry, Jennifer. We're definitely going to need more. So if you can, I don't know if we'll have time today, but certainly you're going to want to give a little bit more information and maybe speak to an employment lawyer. Again, help at employmentlawyer.ca, 1-855-821-5900. Sorry, Jennifer, I couldn't be of more help there. So Bruce, how did the Moderna CEO negotiate a $900 million exit package? Okay, that's outside of my expertise. I don't know anything about that. Antoinette, what if people are being abusive and controlling at your work? Oh, this is an interesting question. So this is always a dangerous one too. So you have a right to a safe and harassment-free workplace. Okay, so if your employer is aware that you are being harassed, so if you make them aware of it and then they don't take corrective action to stop it, and you continue to be harassed, if the harassment meets the appropriate sort of subjective, objective hurdle, so yes, it's clearly harassment, okay, then then you've effectively been constructively terminated. The employer, through its actions of not keeping you safe and harassment free, has effectively terminated you, and therefore you're entitled to severance pursuant to whatever your legal position is. Okay? Now, again, this comes back to what I said earlier. For many of you, yes, that's what you'd want to do. You want to get out of there and get your money on the way out. Okay? For many of you, though, you'd rather stay at your job. And maybe it's a job you've been at for 20 years, and you want to stay there. In which case, this is more of a, can you negotiate it with the powers that be to ensure that you are able to stop the abuse and the harassment and continue to work there. And that's a really difficult needle to thread, particularly if the abuse abuse and harassment is coming from your boss. Happens all the time. Happens a high percentage of the people that I talk to, that's their situation where their boss is behaving really, really badly. In situations like that, it often comes down to he said, she said, and that's not a good place to be, because your legal burden of proof, standard of proof is 50% plus one. Okay, so you have to get over to the more likely plus than not standard, and so if it's a tie, you lose. So the more corroborating evidence you can have, the better. So one of the ways you can do that is you can keep a journal, and journal dates, who was involved, here's what happened. On this day, Bill said this to me using these expletives. I asked him to stop, he didn't stop. On this day, Bill shoved me across the room. And just sort of keep a running tab of it. The corroborating witnesses will also help a lot. Sometimes video or recordings can be of assistance, but you also have to be very careful. There was a decision in, I want to say BC, but maybe it wasn't BC recently, where a just cause termination for the employee recording all of the conversations that he had with his employer occurred. And so, I'm a little bit leery on that front, but corroborating evidence can be of assistance. The important point, Antoinette, is that the harassment abuse needs to objectively be abuse and harassment. Okay, what does a reasonable person think? I talk to many, many people who subjectively believe that the behavior of their boss is abuse or harassment, and they perceive it as such, but objectively it's not going to get them over that hurdle. Okay, and so what that means is if they were to trigger constructive dismissal and they don't get over, yes, this is actually harassment, they effectively have quit their job and they get zero. Okay, on their way out the door. So, those are always risky. And Antoinette, one more thing, Antoinette. If you report this to your boss, I see this all the time too. If it's your boss that's the problem, and you report on your boss above your boss to his boss or her boss or to human resources, quite often you're going to get fired. I see that you shouldn't, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that you can, will assist your legal position, provided, depending on what your employment contract says. But it's still a reality nonetheless. So you got to be really careful exactly what you do. And I would also, Antoinette, before you do anything, I would get legal advice. So again, that's helpemploymentlawyer.ca and 1-855-821-5900. Okay. Couple more questions rolling in. We started late, so I'll go a little bit long today. Jennifer said, yes, it's the vaccine mandate. I still, Jennifer, I have a difficult time with understanding this, because you didn't get a medical exemption, but you did get an accommodation, which sounds to me like an exemption. It sounds like Jennifer could not work. Jennifer has X health issue, and so she can't work unless she has Y accommodation. Unless it's work from home or masks or whatever. So I mean, it's hard for me to tell if it's a work from home situation. Your doctor can't dictate to your employer that you have to work from home. But if you've been working at home for a long period of time, or even before the pandemic, then it'd be, if they then say you got to come back to work, you may have something there, but generally your employer can say to you, yeah, you got to come back to work. You can say, you have to work from work. You don't have a legal right to work at home. So again, Jennifer, I don't have enough information. I'm sorry. Another question from Steph. Can the employee decide how they want the severance paid? No, I mean, it takes two to tango, right? So, you might want something and then the employer has to agree to it, right? So if you want it paid as a lump sum, which is what 99% of you want, you're probably going to have to take a little bit of a discount because you're getting all that money in hand all at once, as opposed to getting it paid over, say, 12 months or whatever your notice period is. The employer benefits from paying you over a longer period of time because cash flow is everything to a business. And if all of a sudden they have to pay out $80,000, that can be a tough situation for the employer's balance sheet. Whereas if they just consider you on the books as an employee for the next 12 months, even though you're not there, that's a lot easier for the employer to deal with. So it depends what the employer is going to agree to. Most of the time, vast majority of the time, gets done as a lump sum, but be prepared to take a discount for that reason. I will say this: I'm a huge bird in the hand guy. That old axiom is words to live by for sure. Bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. If you have to wait 12 months to get all your money, you're in a situation where you're dependent on someone else. And as opposed to if they put the lump sum in your hand now, it's in your hand, right? And they can't take it from you. Now, is that worth taking a discount? Yeah, 100% it is. Because, I don't think I've seen this in employment law, but I have seen it in business where, if they owe you 12 months, what happens if at month 7 they stop paying you? Okay, well, then you got to sue on your settlement. Okay, well, you've got 5 months remaining. Now you got to get a lawyer involved to assist you with that 5 months. It's going to cost you, if you got to pay that lawyer by the hour, a bunch of money to do that, really cutting the value of that thing way down. Or if it were on a percentage basis called contingency, can a lawyer afford to get involved, for that amount? Like it can be a problem, right? And so I would always recommend that everybody, if they have a choice between the two, take the lump sum, even if you have to take a discount, because you have control of that money, not somebody else. Okay, last question. I'm getting fired for being unvaccinated. I'm not going to say, from a municipality on May 31st. What severance should I expect? Okay, so the municipality is in Ontario, so I don't know. I don't know so I'll give you an example. In British Columbia, all government employees must be vaccinated by government order, which means the right to severance has been extinguished entirely. Okay, so I don't know if Ontario has done the same thing. It also, does that apply to municipalities? I think so. If I recall my municipal law from law school, I think a provincial mandate in this situation would apply to municipal employees. Although that is a sort of a legal nuance that's beyond my scope of expertise. But what should you expect? It depends entirely on your legal position. If you're covered by a mandate, you should expect zero, right? But if you're not, depends what your employment contract says, what your age, length of service, your job position was. I'm surprised this is happening now, given the sea change that's happening across Canada for individuals. With respect to public attitudes towards government pandemic restrictions, we'll say. Ed, talk to a lawyer, 100%. You got to do it. You got to talk to an Ontario lawyer. Employmentlawyer.ca. You can reach us at employmentlawyer.ca, help@employmentlawyer.ca, and 1-855-821-5900. You got to do it, Ed, because you don't know what your legal position is, and you need to know. I don't know if it's a hard and fast thing for you with respect to not getting vaccinated, but maybe you're 53 and you're making $85,000 a year and you don't have a university education and you got to get to retirement and you got full benefits and a pension and maybe you can't lose that job. And maybe if you find out that your severance entitlement is zero, maybe that changes your mind with respect to the vaccine. you got to get legal advice, and that goes for almost all of you. It's the vaccine mandate stuff and employer policy stuff. It's too complicated. You need to get legal advice before you make decisions. So please, I'll leave you on that note. Get the legal advice you need before you take any actions. Ed, 100%, you got to do that. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much for joining us and for all your great questions. Again, you can reach us at helpandemploymentlawyer.ca or 1-855-821-5900. Join us on Monday, March 21st with the excellently named Chris Justice. He will explain all things employment law to you, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. So join me 2 weeks from today. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for those great questions, and have a